Good morning and welcome to Data Unmasked, hosted by ACEDS and HaystackID. I'm Maribel Rivera, Vice President of Client Strategy and Strategy and Client Engagement at ACEDS. Data Unmasked is our monthly live stream where we look into how to navigate the complexities of data-related tasks, projects, and programs. Our discussions revolve around the latest trends, best practices, cutting edge technologies in data discovery, management, privacy, cybersecurity, and much more. Today, I am excited to be joined by Chief Artificial Intelligence Officer and Chief Data Scientist, John Brewer. Hi, John.
Hello, how are you today?
I'm wonderful. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much for having me on the program.
No, we always love having you on the program. You joined ACEDS President Mike Quartararo on Data Unmasked earlier this year in March. And you discussed some of the latest and greatest in generative AI, which everybody's talking about. So what's changed over the past few months? And I'm sure there's a lot.
Yeah, I was going to say there's been a lot of development kind of over the summer of 2024. But I think that kind of the headliner development has been that we've actually seen generative AI, especially generative AI in review, transition from a coming soon to an in production technology. We actually have like two different providers just announced in Relativity's ecosystem alone to be able to do first level review using generative AI in that space. And I think there's definitely a feeling right now that the technology has arrived. It's no longer coming soon. It's no longer an idea in the future. It is here. It is a thing that you can go to a service provider and just buy or order. And I think that within the technologically forward-leaning segment of e-discovery, I think it's almost already seen as a tool in the tool belt. We're already seeing kind of the leading edge of this becoming a almost a taken for granted technology, that this is now something that we have and it is another thing that we can deploy in a discovery context.
Interesting. So do you think that LLMs are sufficiently equipped to identify ESI in our e-discovery processes?
Unquestionably within their niche in the ecosystem. There are absolutely limitations to the technology. There are some documents that they're better or worse at reviewing, but in their elements, they have really impressive metrics at costs that are getting comparable to kind of tar-based results even, and in a fraction of the time. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, having human review definitely isn't going away. There's still a lot of documents that LLMs can't handle right now or don't handle as well. But in terms of whether or not they can be used on big hunks of ESI, no, unquestionably the technology is there now.
Do you think some of those costs are going to actually be so low that they surpass what we've been doing traditionally? And I know I've been having a lot of conversations, and I'm throwing you a different question here, but we've been having a lot of conversations and hearing a lot of people talk about having more expertise as far as technical expertise and then subject matter expertise when it comes to document review, because the document especially that first pass review will help to lower the costs of document review.
Yeah, so I think that if you asked me this 6 months ago, I would say that there was a pretty clear delineation, at least from a cost perspective. TAR and Gen AI, which TAR is usually what we're comparing Gen AI to, just as we're getting people acquainted with the technology. Have different cost profiles. TAR is very expensive upfront when you're doing the training, and it is extremely cheap on a per document basis once you've accomplished that. Gen AI has a much more direct cost benefit analysis. There is a training element to it up front when you're writing your prompts, and that can accumulate a certain amount of cost on it, but it is not nearly to the same scale as TAR is up front. And it has so far a higher cost per document that it's running, which implies that tar might still be technology to go with for truly titanic reviews. But even in the last 6 months since I've talked about this, the apparent costs of Gen AI are already starting to come down. So I think that Gen AI is really going to be giving tar a run for its money, even on larger reviews where, again, half a year ago, we might have thought it wasn't practical to run on. I think that we're going to be seeing it practical over a much larger percentage of matters than we thought we would be at this point in the timeline.
Do you think that's one comparison? Are there any other comparisons to traditional e-discovery methods like tar in terms of accuracy and efficiency?
So in terms of accuracy, we're definitely seeing numbers getting posted that are similar to a CAL review. Or tar 2.0, if you prefer that terminology. And the accuracy numbers are right up there in aggregate. Now, I think that if you drill down into individual issues, you start to see some differences, and we can probably talk about that a little later if we get into some of the distinctions that you can get into. Gen AI is a much more detailed technology. It lets you drill down to like individual e-discovery requests and issues in a way that tar never did. And that it both gives you a lot more information, but it also can potentially introduce you to a little more risk in terms of just knowing where your weak points are in a way that you didn't necessarily with tar, or frankly, even with traditional human linear review when we were getting results back from teams of humans.
Interesting. Do you think that LLMs can handle the nuanced legal knowledge required for e-discoveries, such as interpreting like case-specific details, names, dates, and legal issues? I kind of know what you might be going to say, but let me. You're the expert.
I mean, fair. I think that the key thing to understand is that LLMs are very powerful technologies, but it is important to remember they are tools. At the end of the day, the attorney is responsible for the output of the LLM, just as they would be with, if it was a contracted human review team. They are very good at some things. They are less good at other things. For instance, they can find names. Generally, they're very good at dates. They're usually pretty good at relative dates. We have more of a problem with. So things like 4 days ago, 3 months from now, that sort of thing. And some of that's just going to be understanding how to speak to them kind of on their own level when we're doing prompting and whatnot. But from an actual nuanced legal argument perspective, going into the nitty-gritty details of a case, I would never trust an LLM to do that above the attorney who actually understands the matter and understands the details that we wouldn't even necessarily know to put into a rubric. The kind of things that are immediately obvious to a human mind that's operating over a document, but we wouldn't necessarily even think to call out to something like a first level review.
So I'm going to throw out a question for you.
Okay.
That's not on our prep list, but I talked to you a little bit about it. Is how do we think e-discovery professionals and lawyers, right, and litigation support teams need to prepare then to understand AI and the use of LLM?
So the key things to understand when you're preparing to use LLMs in a discovery context or in a review context or really any other way is understanding how they actually compile the information that they're working with. And I know that you can kind of get your short 12-word answer that they predict the next word in the sequence, which is technically true of LLMs. But for the applications that we're actually using them in, that part of the LLM, like the actual kind of mathematics behind it, the Gen AI part of it, is, I wouldn't say it's incidental to the process. It's still a key important process of it. But how the tool uses the output from the LLM is really the important bit to understand, because the models will have biases that they need to go into, and they literally have to. That's how they operate. And you may have heard that they have a bias towards direct language, towards not using negations when you're describing what you want them to do, those sorts of things. That's certainly going to be important to know, but also knowing how to structure requests to work in that, to work to that paradigm, as it were. I think actually it might be more useful to give an example here. So when we're doing reviews, I was talking earlier about how you have issues in reviews, which was something we never did with TAR. With TAR, you either had something that was responsive or you had something that wasn't, and you kind of reviewed it at that level. With all of the major review solutions are out there right now, you can put in individual issues. So a document is responsive if it is talking about a power plant. A document is responsive if it's talking or if it's between executives. And generally speaking, there are a couple of different ways you can lay out these issues. The way that LLMs want you, or the way that you'll be most effective in laying these out, is by putting them in constructively, which is to say, saying that if any of these issues are true, or if we hit on any of these issues, the document's responsive. Where you get yourself into trouble is if you say, oh, well, we need at least 2 of these issues to be responsive, or it is responsive if it hits on any of these 4 issues, but only if it doesn't hit on issue 5. And some of that is just like learning how to state things in an active or affirmative or constructive way. And some of that is just understanding that once you compile all of those hits at the end, you're going to have better overall kind of aggregate metrics if you are hitting on, if you don't have to worry about pulling things back out of your responsiveness set. And just understanding those kind of meta elements of how the tools that are using the LLM evaluate the output to get you to your results is really what I think the actual professionals, the e-discovery professionals and the associates working with this technology are going to really want to learn going forward. And some of that is going to be formally documented, and some of that's going to be in training classes, and some of that's going to be experience. But now that we actually have tools in production, those tools themselves are going to have idiosyncrasies that are going to make a big difference in the success or failure of a given review or summarization or any other matter that we're doing with large language models.
Interesting. Thank you. That's an amazing answer. I love that. And more detailed than I get that from a lot of other people when having those discussions. So I'm glad to hear that. How are legal professionals and technologists working together to ensure that LLMs meet the rigorous demands of e-discovery review?
Closely, I would say. So fortunately, I was going to say, fortunately, we've had like a decade and a half of TAR at this point, which has given us mathematical tools to address success and failure, things like recall and precision, and these various statistical items. And those tools are useful in the Gen AI world. We have to build on them, and we have to use somewhat more complex models than we use with TAR. But we have a large community of individuals in the e-discovery space who are already literate in that terminology, in the statistics, in the underlying metrics of using technology to evaluate written documents. And that has proven to be extremely useful as Gen AI has moved forward. And I think that's why we're seeing Gen AI kind of get adopted within the kind of technologically forward-leaning community faster than we saw TAR, because we're already able to describe it in the terminology that we spent, a decade or more establishing literacy on. And that actually works very well for us. Now, in terms of what are we doing to specifically work with LLMs, I can speak for my team at least, has been fortunate enough that HaystackID has been around for quite a while. We have a significant backlog of cases, And we've had clients who were generous enough to approve particular pieces of case data and particular matters that we had previously done either with linear review or with TAR, and rerun them kind of at our expense to through generative AI, basically re-review entire document sets using generative AI to determine in an apples to apples comparison whether or not this technology was up to the level of our existing linear and TAR-based solutions. And I think more than anything else, that has really driven home that the technology does what it does, and more importantly, you can build processes around it to be successful with something like a review and get results that are comparable to, or in many cases superior to, frankly, what we were doing with more traditional methods.
Awesome. So let's talk about in the beginning of this interview, you mentioned, that we're no longer just talking about generative AI and in theory, we're actually doing. So provide me a couple of examples of successful integrations of LLMs into the e-discovery process. And what are some of the challenges that people are encountering with that?
Okay, so obviously, we've been kind of focused on first level review because that's been kind of sucking all the air out of the room, proverbially speaking, during the summer of 2024. And rightly so. It's an amazing technology and it has far reaching implications. What we are probably, some of the major challenges that we've been seeing are frankly dealing with data that is easy for humans to handle, but difficult for machines. And again, we've been using LLMs and Gen AI pretty much interchangeably in this conversation. There's a whole realm of generative AI that handles audio data and video data and image data, all of which is subject to e-discovery searches and requirements. That kind of multimodal approach is very much, it's definitely in the lab and it's being worked on. And I think I've even seen image tagging and video tagging applications that do technically use LLM models under the hood. Although, the actual output is similar to what we would see with a traditional ML classifier, machine learning classifier rather, that those are out there. I think that those are going to become more advanced as they move forward. I think there's been a lot of focus on the written language just because of the preponderance of e-discovery data that is simply text. But I think that those are very much kind of hot on the heels of the LLM models that are doing that work. And even within LLM models, we are seeing kind of the evolution of the tools that we saw coming out in the summer of 2023. Those first like summarization tools and condensation tools that were coming out are absolutely not only getting more accurate and becoming faster and cheaper and better as they evolve, but also we're finding new use cases for them. One of the most obvious, I shouldn't say obvious because I didn't realize it until I had actually seen it. But one of the more outstanding examples that I've seen is summarization of documents, especially email chains, where you'll have 20 pages of emails and things like that.
All the threading.
Yeah, exactly. Just having that summarized, one, makes it easier for a human to read, and that was kind of the selling point. But one thing that I don't think was originally in the design, but has proven to be either something you get for free or something that you get with only slight tweaks to the product, is more easily getting keywords out of those documents so that those summaries can subsequently be processed by STR or regular expression tools, because concepts that weren't necessarily expressed as an easily searchable keyword become keywords in the summarization. And so this is another case where we have LLM or generative AI technologies that are actually enhancing the effectiveness of legacy technologies as we deploy them in ways that weren't necessarily foreseen, or at least weren't necessarily headlining features of those capabilities when they first came out.
So you've always been an advocate for using each tool for what it's best suited for, right?
Yeah.
What are the potential risks and benefits of incorporating like LLMs into e-discovery workflows? What do people who are the buyers need to really understand and put in place before they just go out and start buying tools and just adding them to their tech stacks?
So there's an interesting bias in this, in that we're still in the early days with this technology. It feels like it's been around forever, but really it's been like 18 months. And most people who have had their hands on it have been kind of the enthusiastic lifelong learner types who, legitimately enjoy learning how these things work, which is awesome. And it's gotten us very far, very fast. But now we're talking about taking the tools out of that context, out of that community, and putting them in the hands of users who just want to get their flipping work done and go home at the end of the day. And those users see them in a different context, in a much more kind of direct context. And it is difficult from that former group to tell how the latter group is going to use it. The example that I often use is like, you can go down to Home Depot this afternoon and go buy a circular saw that just has some tool instructions, and with some common sense, you can figure out how to cut a hole in your wall to install a light switch. And a contractor might do that with similar tools and look very similar as they're going about their work, but there's kind of like these million little checks that's in their head and pieces of information they're thinking about as they're like looking at the wall and cutting into it, and that tell them what's safe to do and what's not. And they're not even consciously thinking about it. To the lay observer, the expert and the amateur look identical in how they're going about their job, but then the amateur hits an iron pipe or a live electrical main, and suddenly the risks become very inherently obvious. I think within the e-discovery LLM community up to this point, at least among those who are building these tools kind of for production use, that's the biggest fear right now. Either somebody is going to come up with an innovative way to use the technology that ignores a risk that was kind of so ingrained that we were like, why would we warn anybody about that? That's obvious. Oh, well, it's not obvious to everybody, or that we'll fail to communicate what those risks are clearly to people.
Right.
I think that's kind of the nightmare scenario that I've had people who are actually working on these express. It's not the known unknowns, as it were. It's the unknown unknowns. How are people going to take this and innovate with it? Which is obviously something that we want to encourage. But how do we concisely explain that there are subtle failure modes that you can get into with LLMs that can be very costly? And that's why, if you've seen any of the material that I put out in the last, probably a year, we've been harping on benchmarking, validation, double checking the work, drilling down, because again, it's a very powerful tool and it will get the job done, but making sure it does the job correctly is what we really care about.
Yeah. And I would just say, if you're using a circular saw to cut an electrical outlet, then you should definitely have a professional come in and assist you.
Exactly.
So let's talk a little bit about benchmarking and validation, since we're talking about that, right? You're talking about how they play a role in evaluating effectiveness. You've done a lot of it. Let's dig into that a little bit, and then I want to dig into something new that you just launched over at HaystackID.
Okay. Fantastic.
Benchmarking and
and
validation protocol.
So let me talk a little bit about that. So validation is a place where I think validation is where providers are actually distinguishing themselves right now in the current environment. With TAR, we kind of only really validate at the document level, but as I kind of alluded to earlier, LLMs, you can drill down to particular issues or criteria and understand how you're dealing or how well you're doing on the individual subjects of the discovery request. One of the key elements of using an LLM to review documents is that we want them to be on that constructive pattern that I spoke about earlier. You want to kind of add things together. And that will save you in relevance review by using that kind of constructive model. That will save you on your final aggregate recall and precision metrics, which are often what we're reporting on when we're using AI or TAR to do these reviews. And the reason we do it that way is that, even if the LLM is bad about finding documents about dolphins, but it's good at finding documents that mention a dolphin trainer, the top level results will still look good because most of the documents that talk about dolphins also mention the dolphin trainer. And so at the end of the day, we get most of the documents that we're looking for. In relevance review, that's okay. We build that up, and unless you have some extremely adversarial opposing party who's demanding to see your breakdown at the issue level, which I wouldn't recommend which you might want to cover during your ESI protocol negotiation. That probably isn't something that should be on the table. It's never going to come up. The bigger risks are with other kinds of review that might not be as obvious. Right now, the example that I would give is privilege review, where we do have a number of different criteria that we need to meet to assert privilege over a document, and you need to match all of those criteria. You can't just match any of them. It has to have certain properties that are in place. And in those cases, even having one of the kind of prompt criteria on your LLM underperforming can seriously, damage the quality of your review. And obviously, privilege reviews are usually a higher stakes activity than just a relevance review. And that's really why we're not seeing privilege review out there in the ecosystem. It's not kind of in production the same way the relevance review is. It's not only a higher risk application of LLM technology, but it's an inherently more difficult problem from a technological perspective.
Okay, awesome. So I want to talk about, I read an announcement, your team sent it over, very excited. So you recently launched Core Intelligence AI. What is Core Intelligence AI, so for our viewers, and what differentiates it from other Gen AI tools that are in the market right now? And why should people care?
Okay, fair enough. So Core Intelligence AI is the extension of Haystack Core into the AI and the Gen AI space. As we've kind of discussed so far, there's a lot of little details with Gen AI that can complicate or add unnecessary risk to Gen AI review. I think the advantages to using Gen AI, especially in relevance review in terms of speed and accuracy and cost, are too titanic for the technology not to be widely adopted over the next few years. But anytime a new technology is kind of percolating through the industry, it needs to be managed. We're not building a solution from scratch the way like eDiscovery AI or the AIR team over at Relativity are. Both of those groups are doing great work, and they're getting the technology piece of the puzzle up and running. The real challenges, though, are how to make the technology work the way that we want to, kind of that we touched on previously, producing credible, reliable, superior results. Quite frankly, our colleague organizations are doing an awesome job in getting the technology to the point where it can do the review and all of these other tasks. Core Intelligence AI is about taking the specific task the client lays before us and doing it right, regardless of what product or process or procedure we're using to get there. Essentially, with any new revolution, you're going to see innovations and new failure modes and different things that don't quite work out. Core Intelligence AI is about using the tools and capabilities that are on the table right now, minimizing the risks involved with generative AI technology by going through the benchmarking, the validation, and the lessons learned over the last 18 months that we have, and actually harvesting the benefits of these technologies in a real and forward-looking way.
Awesome. So one last question for you, or two last questions for you, right? As the Chief Artificial Intelligence Officer, which is one of the newest titles in the industry. It's not just about Gen AI, it's about AI overall. So I would say, what's next for you and your team? What excites you most about generative AI or just AI in general for the legal industry?
So I would say that the really exciting part for me right now is that we are kind of at the end of the initial, I wouldn't call them trivial, but like the obvious use cases. People were saying we're going to be able to use Gen AI for first level review since early 2023, and 18 or 20 months later, we're seeing that in production. We're there. Summarization and compilation have obviously been around even longer, but at this point, we have teams that have been working with this technology, building these tools for about 2 years now. And when you're in that development process, you learn a bunch of things about the technology that aren't obvious, that aren't kind of intrinsic. And unfortunately, you're working on a project. You need to deliver your project. You can make a note in your notebook, but then you kind of have to move on with life. Now that we're actually seeing the last of those major obvious capabilities delivered and in production, now all of the really brilliant engineers and researchers and visionaries who have been working on this are having an opportunity to go back to their notes and say, hey, you remember back in June of last year when we saw that really weird thing happen? I want to go back and I want to take a closer look at that. I think there's a product there. And I think that the next year is probably going to be pretty quiet, but I think 2028, we're going to be seeing the really non-intuitive tools coming out, the really neat applications of this technology that were kind of learned along the way. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what those are going to look like.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing what you come up with then. We'll see what you and your team come up with. But John, we're a little over our time.
Totally
it's okay. We love that because I think this is always very educational. So thank you so much for joining us again. I'm hoping we'll see you in the next 6 months with some more updates for us on AI and where we're going in the market.
Looking forward to it.
Good. And we have a treat this month because we get 2 Data Unmasked this month. Next one is October 23rd, and I'm going to be joined by John's colleague, Jonathan Flood. So please tune in for that, add it to your calendars, and we will see you then. Thank you, John.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, John.
Yep. No, thank you very much, Mirel.